It's the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez coming to you from Baltimore. On Thursday, February 18th, following a week-long visit to Mexico, Pope Francis gave a holy mass at the fairgrounds of the U.S.-Mexico border city of Ciudad Juarez. During the Pope's plane ride back to the Vatican, Pope Francis was directly asked about the Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump's plan to build a wall on the U.S.-Mexico border to prevent illegal immigration. Let's have a look at what the Pope said.
A person that only thinks to rebuild walls, wherever they may be, instead of building bridges, is not Christian.
Donald Trump responded to the Pope's comments with this.
If and when the Vatican is attacked by ISIS, which, as everyone knows, is ISIS's ultimate trophy, I can promise you that the Pope would have only wished and prayed that Donald Trump would have been president. For a religious leader to question a person's faith is disgraceful. I'm proud to be a Christian, and as president, I will not allow Christianity to be consistently attacked and weakened, unlike what is happening now with our current president.
Joining us now from Oakland, California to discuss this is David Bacon. David is an award-winning photojournalist, author, and immigrant rights activist who has spent over 20 years as a labor organizer. His most recent book is The Right to Stay Home, How U.S. Policy Drives Mexican Migration. David, so good to have you back.
It's good to be with you.
So, David, I know you're not a religious scholar, but what do you think of Pope's comments, given that you've been writing about border issues for a while now?
Well, I think that the Pope made actually a very mild comment, a mild criticism, because he says, who thinks only about building walls and not about building bridges. So what the Pope is saying is that we need to reach out to each other more as human beings and consider ourselves as fellow human beings on this planet, and worry less about any kind of supposed need for separating ourselves as one does with a wall. But I do think that the Pope is trying to get us to question the wisdom in this country of what is really clearly a very disastrous immigration policy, the symbol of which is the wall between the U.S. and Mexico. We don't have a wall like this in Canada. We have a wall like this between the U.S. and Mexico, which has a lot to do with the racist way in which many people in this country, beginning with Donald Trump, are looking at people from Mexico and Central America as though instead of people who he wants to welcome into this country as people have been, or at least as the official ideology of this country would have us having done for our entire existence, he's saying that we should look at people from other countries in a very hostile way. Then Trump goes on to say, no leader, especially a religious leader, should have the right to question another man's religion or faith. And this is coming from a man who has said that he would oppose even children coming from the Middle East, essentially because of their religion. So I think obviously there's an element of hypocrisy as well as an element of racism here. And it's really an unwillingness to look at what the Pope is actually saying, which is that instead of building walls and instead of criminalizing people who are migrating, that we should look at the roots of migration. The Pope has been very clear about that. What is it that is leading to the displacement of people? And what is leading to the uprooting of whole communities so that people are crossing borders, and that we have to deal with this at its roots rather than simply putting up a wall and saying anybody that crosses it is guilty of a crime and should be deported, which is another thing that Trump has said.
Now, the Pope declared this border crisis as a humanitarian crisis. Along with the United Nations, actually, UNHCR has come out and deemed the refugee crisis between the U.S.-Mexico border as one of the gravest crises that the world is facing. And although they're not fleeing war, it is an economic issue-generated migration. So give us a sense of what those issues are that the Pope was actually referring to when he called this a humanitarian crisis.
Well, to begin with, the Pope was speaking at a memorial that was erected on the border to remember the people who have died crossing it. So that's a humanitarian crisis. The fact that hundreds of people who are ordinary working people, farmers, children, families are dying on this border, whether they drown in the Rio Grande or whether they die in the desert. There's a cemetery in Holtville in the Imperial Valley in California, which consists exclusively of people who have been found and who have died trying to cross the desert. So that's certainly a humanitarian crisis. And both he and the UNHCR are also referring to, I believe, the U.S. policy of detention and deportation, that when families cross that border, women and children, they are put into a privately run detention center and then held there, and then in many cases deported afterwards. And certainly the administration has announced that it's beginning a program for finding these people and then sending them back to Central America to the very conditions that they were fleeing from. But I think that the Pope is also, again, saying that part of the humanitarian crisis consists of the reasons why people are coming. So if we're looking at Syria or Libya, we're looking at war. People are fleeing bombings. People are fleeing, for their lives, really, literally. And that we have to look at the need to, instead of increasing the bombing and increasing, the supplying of arms into these areas, we have to look for a road to peace. But I think that also the Pope is looking at the economic reasons for displacement and saying that it is a humanitarian crisis when people are driven by poverty and hunger to leave home and to make a very dangerous journey across the border, which could lead to their dying, as it has in many cases, only to find imprisonment and deportation on the other side, that he believes that this is a humanitarian crisis as well.
And David, lastly, when Donald Trump suggested building a wall, where does he suggest we build it, on Rio Grande?
Well, it's just a rhetorical device, really, because to begin with, one of the problems I think the Pope is trying to highlight is that there already is a wall. What Trump is basically, he's using the wall as a symbol to kind of, appeal for the votes of people who have very nativist, sympathies, and say, vote for me and I'll try and keep those Mexicans or those Central Americans out. And then he says that he is going to make Mexico pay for the wall, which, I don't know, regardless of how people react to it here in the United States. In Mexico, people are just outraged by that comment because, to begin with, people hate the wall because of its symbolism. And then to say that he is somehow, as the president of the United States, going to force Mexico to pay for such a wall is regarded as a very insulting and insensitive comment. So I think that Trump is basically, this is all just his effort to appeal to anti-nativist, to anti-immigrant sentiment, to nativist sentiment, and to call it by its right name, racist sentiment, as a way of getting votes.
And a Mexican official is on record saying if Rio Grande was on their side, they'd be happy to pay for the building of the wall. Thank you so much for joining us, David.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.